Well, man, it was great seeing you this weekend down there in hot Atlanta.
Oh,
So
yeah.
for the listeners, I'd love to say we took the show on the road, but it was actually just us coming down to Atlanta to,
Well, let's say that it's expansion that our producer,
that is
certainly
true.
had. Yes. Yeah. So our producer has gotten a little too big for Virginia, and he's going to come down here to the A and see what he can make of it.
And we're not talking, when he says the A, we're not talking Australia, which, by the way, our producer also notified us that the Mental Advantage podcast has become quite the thing in Australia. So for those of you listening in Australia, send us a note. I'd love to hear, because the actual demographics of listeners for you all listening. So we get all kinds of different, I mean, as you can imagine with podcasts, there's all sorts of different
there's
metrics.
All kinds of analytics and metrics and business intelligence. And, people listen here and they leave here. And I mean, the feedback that we get from, and
it's very interesting.
Application is very interesting. It is odd that, people tune in and they leave after about 4 minutes. I don't know what that's about. But
yeah, they're like they like the beginning and they like the end.
Like the end.
Yeah. They so the funny thing about the analytics is Brandon and I have found out two things in doing this show. One, Ireland, big following over there in Ireland. We're actually ranked as one of the top shows in Ireland, which is interesting. So again, you folks in Ireland, my home country, make sure you're sending in your emails to podcast@mentaladvantage.net. And then also in Australia, we would love to know just where you're listening, maybe how you found out about us, and when we can come and do that remote show that we've been talking about.
We have been talking about doing a remote show, and we would definitely like to come down there and do it with a live audience.
Yeah. So this weekend, Brandon, I was watching the JMU football game. They were in the semifinals playing Sam Houston State and had a big lead, 24-3, rolling, goes into halftime. Next thing you know, Sam Houston wasn't having it. They were like, hey, I hope you all enjoyed that lead. We're going to go ahead and drop 28 in the third quarter on you. And then we'll see how you adjust to that. By the way, Andy Reese, one of our friend of the show, Andy, is also a big Sam Houston State guy.
Did his wife go there?
I think so. Yeah. He was posting some stuff on Instagram about that. And but yeah, so JMU lost, but it was interesting because now they have reached this point at James Madison where they should win in their minds, the fan base is like, hey, we should win all of these games. Like there's no game we should lose. And that can kind of be one of those things. It's this balancing act where you have a coach that comes in, whether in Cignetti's situation, he inherited a really good culture that had already been established by Mickey Matthews, and then ultimately by Mike Houston. And then finally, Kurt Cignetti has been there as the coach, but they're at that point now where they feel like they should win a lot of these games. Sure. And that's great. You develop that culture, but next thing you know, expectations go up.
Well, expectations go up. Maybe that's a niche where we could actually go and talk to the fan bases.
Oh, there you go.
About not focusing on the result and focusing on the process. I'm sure we get a lot of buy-in from the coaches.
Right.
I do think, John, what's interesting is, coming on the heels of having Dr. Aaron Goodson on from, Mississippi State, one of the things that he had brought up that I think is really interesting, and I think you had actually even posed the question, which is now that mental performance and counseling in sports psychology is actually becoming kind of an arrow in the quiver of recruitment, right? And I do think it's interesting how fan bases create a false sense of expectation. And we talked about it before too, where you wonder where that comes from, right? You wonder where grown men and women have blindly put their faith. And look, I mean, we're talking about this, and I can tell you, I'm a huge Auburn guy. I expect them to compete and things like that. But where you put your an unspoken expectation on the coach and the players, remember, are 17 to 22,
oh, yeah.
23.
And that was the other thing Aaron talked about, Dr. Goodson talked about last week, is these are 17 through 20-year-olds.
Right.
Like, the amount of things that people are putting on them is amazing,
Right. And so I think what it all kind of boils down to is a culture, and it really does start with coaches at that level trying to set and level set and set the right expectations at certain schools. You and I spoke about it. I mean, you're in Nashville right now, and I remember when it came out. I don't exactly remember the date, but it was probably 6 or 7 years ago, where Vanderbilt basically said, "Look, we don't put a huge emphasis on football. Our culture is built around academics.
Yep.
Our culture is built around, from a sports performance perspective, around sports that don't require, because they are unyielding and they are not bending when it comes to their academic standards.
Absolutely.
Period.
Yep.
And so to play a sport there becomes extremely demanding, and to find kids that can handle, look, there's a ton of smart kids out there, but to find the kids that can handle the rigors of what it takes to play a sport and attend that school scholastically are very difficult. And to find 80 or 100 of them on a football team and be competitive with other places that don't have that level of academic scrutiny, it's tough.
Yeah, and it's a challenge for the coaches, because on the one hand, you want to so badly establish that culture. Mm-hmm. I think I've shared this story before, that when I first started working with Bridgewater College softball, I sat down with their captains and I told them, years from now, you may or may not be remembered for the victories that you all have had, or the championships or winning seasons. You may not break any school records as it relates to wins and losses. But what you have an opportunity to do is start to lay the foundation and establish a culture. And every coach wants to do that. And you want to be very specific and intentional about that culture. Is what do you, we've talked about that before, what you accept, you promote, cultures, what leads when nobody's watching. I mean, there's a lot of really positive things about culture, but you've just developed this, but at and that's what gets those results. It's that, the whole thing about leaders, leaders develop culture develops behaviors create results. All of those things we've talked about, the byproduct of that is a lot of success, but the byproduct of that success is these fans that aren't, it's called fanatics for a reason, right? They're not always rational. And it just always, I have to chuckle, because as people who both played college sports and have, parented college athletes and also coached college players, it always amazes me every time, and I'm the guilty of it myself, right? I mean, everybody gets really fired up about these games and stuff, but when you really step back and set aside and step away from it all, and you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, like it's not, it's huge, in the moment, sure. But sometimes it's just this thing like, well, that person should be fired. Like, that's my favorite thing is let's get rid of them. They lost a game. And I was sharing with Brandon when we were talking about James Madison, for example, is you're talking about a coach who's lost now 3 games in like a couple years. Like he lost, one was a national championship game, by the way. One was a semifinal game to make it to the national championship. And then the other one was against a FBS school. So it's like, okay, that's your 3.
I mean, those are and should be highly competitive games, right? Yes, so,
and had a chance to win every single one of those. Like literally, it was like within a possession that that's the thing. The game.
And what people, if a lot of our listeners did play at a certain level. I think that's probably what draws them to the podcast a little bit. But all of them, from an empathy standpoint, if you could put yourself in the athlete's shoes, you'd probably have a little different outlook walking through the gate to watch them play. I mean, I can tell you there was never, I can't remember a single time that I walked into a game concerned about what the fans thought. Not one time.
No.
Not a single time did I think, well, I wonder what they think today. It just didn't happen. And that wasn't, and that's not a knock on the fans that come out and support, the athletes, but it is something to be aware of, that when you're out there and you expect a coach to be, to do a certain thing or a player to do a certain thing, you don't always know what's going on behind the scenes. You don't know that, certain coaches hopefully think that it may be better to develop good men and women than to necessarily go out and win that game, which means I may have to discipline someone that I know could have an impact for the positive on the game.
Yeah.
I may have to do some things as a coach that I'm not going to tell you about, that really it isn't your business to know. And it's for the betterment of the team. And I say that with just kind of a peek behind the curtain, and everyone is unfortunately, one of the guys on this story has passed away. But do you remember when you and I got called in at Charleston? The Knicks were in town, and this was their preseason. And Pat Riley did not appreciate the shape, both the literal shape of the player that showed up. He had signed a contract, came in. I think he was about 45 pounds overweight, and they were going to scrimmage, and you and I were going to keep stats. And I remember it was the first time I'd ever heard a player talk back to a coach.
Yes,
the way that he did.
I tell this story all the time because what's so funny about this story, Brandon, is when Brandon says he talked back, I mean, he literally was like, said some things that would cause a fight, and Pat Riley was ready to fight. I mean, they were ready to go after each other or whatever. And Brandon and I are just sitting there, just kind of watching this thing unfold. And so they're getting ready to go after each other. Well, then, the player gets kicked out of, first of all, Pat Riley had kicked him out of the scrimmage and just told him to go sit down. And then the player's still over there and he won't leave. And Pat Riley said, you need to leave and go back to the hotel. Well, he's still sitting over there. Finally, Pat Riley's holding a ball. He just spikes the basketball and he says, that's it. Practice is over. He goes, and you're a, he says a few words to him. Well, then that's when things almost get heated. And then everyone gets separated. Pat Riley, being the ultra competitive person he is, he's ready to go after him. They all get separated. And I remember on that staff is Jeff Van Gundy. So Van Gundy is there. And so Brandon and I, along with maybe a couple other people were there. We go back to the SID room. Remember that?
Spider. Well,
Spider comes in. He says,
out. So Spider
damage control.
And Spider has basically has our money because they, as an NCAA athlete, we were allowed to make a certain amount, but it couldn't exceed a certain amount. Anyway, whatever. But Spider shows up and he has our money. Well, what we never had experienced before was the New York media. And if you remember, they were just lined up.
Ready to go.
When we walked in, they were looking at us like, I wonder what those guys are doing going into practice. And when we came out about 10 or 15 minutes later, they were very curious what it was that we had done or seen or whatever. And I remember Spider handing us our money and was like, remember, you didn't see anything.
That's right.
You didn't hear anything. This never happened.
Yeah. And, it's like hush money. It was a little bit of hush money.
So fast forward about to the end of the week, because they're going to play at the time.
The Rockets, I think.
The Washington Bullets.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Sean Bradley, George Mirasan, so 7'6", 7'7", Chris Webber. They were still the Bullets at the time. This was pre
Wizards.
Yeah. And so the player in question was a scratch, quote unquote scratch, because he had a sprained ankle. And I remember thinking, okay, this tells you everything you need to know as a fan. So when you're expecting your team to win, or you're putting money on your team to cover a spread or whatever it is, the fact that what you see for that 2 to 3 hours out on the court, field, whatever it is such a very, very small snapshot of what is going on in that culture, in that team, within that dynamic. There is so much more that goes on to making decisions, to putting people out on the field or out on a court. And it really does boil down to culture. And the more, if you truly want to be a fan, if you truly want to know what's going on, invest in understanding the culture that those coaches are trying to develop. Don't worry about are they going to run a 3-4 and walk some guys up and or a 4-3 and don't worry about what their defensive scheme is. I'm trying to understand what their culture is, because that will give you more understanding about the team that you choose to cheer for and the expectations that you should have based upon the expectations that the coach has of those particular players.
Well, they say about culture is that strategy is only half the equation, culture is the other half. We've had this discussion on the show where player-driven teams, like if you're looking and evaluating the team that is you're pulling for, if it looks like there's a player-driven team that you see moments on the field where the players are taking control, those teams are going to be way more successful than coach-driven teams. I mean, that's always been the case, is when the ownership is there from the player perspective. I mean, that was with the Bulls teams. I mean, granted, Michael Jordan was Michael Jordan, but the rest of the Bulls respected Michael Jordan, and he ran that, and so that helps when it comes to that culture being developed there. But it's really interesting. And I don't know if my point was made last week when I was talking about the fact that we only play games like 5 to 10% of the time. What you just said was exactly what I was hoping to get across to people, which is, the 5 to 10% of the time that you're actually playing games, that's such a small percentage compared to all of the rest of that time, 90% is in practice and in the locker room and in the weight room and all of the off the season stuff. That's why whenever you're saying as a fan, I can't believe they don't play so-and-so, I wish they would play this person or whatever, you don't have any clue as to what's going on in the 90% of the time when it's, when they're practicing, when you don't understand if that kid is showing up late for workouts in the morning at 5:00 for weightlifting or whatever the case may be.
They're not in their playbook.
Yeah.
They're not making it to mandatory study hall. They've been absent from class. I mean, there's so many things that I don't know that the listeners understand that happen at, various levels of collegiate athletics where, you are required to do some of these things. And if you don't do them, there are usually consequences to it.
Right. And if you don't do it and the coach accepts that, then it's that whole, what you accept, you promote. Like now everybody else, he can't hold anybody else accountable. So I don't care how good you are as a baseball player, basketball player, football player. If you're not willing to follow the rules, then you're going to be, that's why I always tell parents this story. So when I first started coaching in college, and I remember, when that looked like that was a route I was going to be taking, I started making recruiting. This was back when you filled out the questionnaires. If you were a prospective recruit, you filled out the questionnaires for your stats and everything else. You sent them into colleges. Well, at the College of Charleston, we'd have a stack of these cards where people had filled out. And Coach Cibateri was like, John, hey, take these home and call these coaches and talk to them about the players. And the number one question I always asked every single parent or coach that I talked to was, what's the kid's GPA? And people were like, oh, that makes sense. You got to make sure they're eligible. And it was like, no, what the GPA tells you, yeah, of course you want to check and see if they're eligible, but it's also going to let you know that this kid's self-disciplined enough to study. He's self-disciplined enough to make good grades. He's got because if he's disciplined enough to make the good grades, then you're not going to have to worry about him getting up at 5:30 in the morning for a workout.
No, they're not. Typically those dudes aren't lazy. And so again, to go full circle and bring Vanderbilt back into the
in Virginia and those
Virginias
schools
of the world, and you look at where they do have success, and they have success on the teams that typically have fewer athletes, the baseball team, the basketball team, the teams where you can find 11 to 20 kids that buy into a culture. And think of this too, John, where those, and especially for baseball, because you and I know that a little more intimately, there's only 11.7 scholarships.
Right.
So if I can go out and I can recruit a smart kid, what do they bring along with them? Academic money. So now they don't have to necessarily be a drain on just the baseball team and the baseball team's money, which means we can now go out and be very competitive because that culture actually feeds and promotes what we're trying to do here on a smaller team level. I can go out and divide that 11.7 across 25 kids because all of them, especially like a Vanderbilt or a Virginia, are getting some type of academic scholarship just because of how smart they are. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gotten past the admissions standard. So it's stuff like that, and you and I've talked about before. You give me a really smart athlete, and I mean, you don't have to be a great athlete, but give me a smart athlete, they figure it out. They have the IQ for the game, whatever the game is. They typically can figure it out. And from a culture standpoint, I'll take that all day long.
Well, it's one of those things that if you've got, even like with the 11.7 scholarships, only 50% of the Division I schools in the country even have the full 11.7. So there's there's a lot of D1 schools that aren't even funded for the full allotment. So you're exactly right. That academic piece and using the smart players, it's just really important. I think it's one of those things that we talk about all the time, and we'll unpack culture a little bit more in the future. But there's so many different things that we could go into, because a lot of people think that culture is just like that mission statement hung on the wall, and a lot of programs try to do it that way, but it's not going to be successful because if no one on the team is behind that mission, no one on the team understands what's our core principles as a program. I don't care how many posters you have hanging up, it's not going to work out. But you see a lot of coaches try to do that because they feel like, well, they hear culture has become that big buzzword. Businesses are the same way. Brian Kite talked about that before, which is, a culture where everybody is happy and comfortable is not a very good culture to have if you're a business, because that means no one can be honest with each other. Nobody can give honest feedback because everyone's just worried about being, happy and go lucky. So anyhow, we'll talk more about that in the future. But expectations, guys, manage those expectations. That's how we got started on that whole thing, was about James Madison. Big guest coming up this Friday. Dr. Mo Pickens is back for the Grand Slam series. You all might remember that for part 2, which will be, of course, around the PGA Championship that's happening at Kiowa next week. We're really excited to have Dr. Mo back on the program. We had a lot of good feedback on that. Speaking of feedback, questions, comments, podcast at mentaladvantage.net. Definitely send in. We had a lot of fun with those questions last week. So let's send some in. Any comments, feedback, any of that stuff, send in to podcast at mentaladvantage.net. All right, man. Great job. Buddy. We'll talk to you soon.
It sounds like a plan. See you, brother.
Thanks.